Bill, maybe switching gears here a bit. So in
Sure.
this agreement, there are typically purchase price adjustments. Can you just explain purchase price adjustments and when they occur?
Sure. When the deal closes, when the transaction closes, a balance sheet will be produced either that day or maybe at the close of business the day before. That's going to be an estimated balance sheet because that month or that period is not closed, and it usually takes a little bit of time to close out the books. Typically, business doesn't close its books on the first of the month. It closes a week or 2 or 3 weeks, or in some cases a few months if they're not as diligent, but it just takes time for that dust to settle. So typically 30 to 60 days after the closing of a transaction, the actual balance sheet will be produced, and that will be compared to the estimated balance sheet at the time of closing. And if any adjustments need to be made, that can be made. Maybe there's additional payment, maybe that comes out of money that has been put into escrow if the seller owes the buyer, maybe the buyer provide some extra money into escrow. That will all be determined in the purchase agreement, but that's called the true-up period. That's usually 30 to 60 days after the closing.
Mm-hmm. Michael, do you want to add to that? Just the purchase agreement, and it's usually around working capital, right? Working capital is usually one of the bigger purchase price adjustments in the definitive agreements.
Yeah, that's the one that takes up the most time. And so when you think about what's the dispute and the likely working capital, it's possibly some things you haven't disclosed, but it's usually things like inventory values. Receivables are pretty easy. So ultimately, I think most of our debates come around inventory. I think by doing a good job going through an inventory analysis before the transaction closes, we rarely have surprises in that area. But it is an area, if I zeroed in on one thing, it would probably be inventory values.
Yes, Simon, you want to add to purchase price adjustments, just the conversation on and how, the mechanics of it?
Yeah, I think the other area, there is normalized working capital and the net debt calculation. Obviously, you can do away with that by having a lockbox, so a balance sheet set at a date prior to completion that everyone can verify and validate beforehand. And that may then give rise to leakage provisions, which then become your price adjustment. The other area, which is quite a big area, and I think with COVID we'll see more, is the earn-out mechanism, because that is a price adjustment. And the company may have to hit a certain profit number going forward, and on which basis the vendors may get more money, or may not get the full amount as they're expecting, because they'll have a profit target to hit. And that can be an area, looking at earn-out protections as well as a calculation, that can be quite a complex area to negotiate into the sale and purchase agreement.
Just really quickly, can we talk about just maybe the calculation, like the actual calculation of the purchase price adjustment? How involved should the investment banker be? Bill, maybe you can talk about that. I know it happens a period after the transaction closes. So how involved is the investment banker in that calculation?
We're obviously involved up to the point of the sale, helping them produce that information or tell their controller or work with their CFO to produce that closing balance sheet. Quite often the lawyers are directing it because they're handling the closing. After the transaction closes, our involvement has typically ended. Sometimes they might contact us just for some clarification or to get an updated document, but that's typically going to be driven by the seller's attorney. Has been our experience, because the transaction gets done and then our work typically wraps up at that point.
Michael, do you find the same thing? Your involvement kind of ends after the transaction closes, or do you help with purchase price adjustments?
If we often are deeply involved in the negotiation of exactly how the working capital number is set, what's included, what's not included. And so I would say that we are pretty involved in that debate. And so although our job ended, it's something where because we've been leading the negotiation on what the right target is, they want us as the, I'll say the quarterback of that process, not necessarily counting the beans, but what was the intent? If there's a dispute, often is, well, that shouldn't have, it wasn't included in the closing balance sheet. Why are you now including it in the balance sheet 90 days later? Well, the answer is usually because it's GAAP.
Yeah.
Well, so now you can see the argument. Well, then we should have used that as the closing balance sheet. So it gets the debate often. It's important that we're there.
Mm-hmm.
It's, if I can jump in, it's also quite often how long or how many months are used if an average working capital calculation is going to be used. And I might have mentioned this before. We had a client a few years ago that was growing nicely, but the working capital was actually decreasing despite increase in profit and revenue, because they were running the business very well, basically a just-in-time process. And so what we told the buyer is a 12-month average for working capital will artificially set a bogey that's too high, and that will cost our clients some money. So it was a discussion. It was a very cordial discussion, but they agreed to a 6-month average because they saw what was going on and the way this business was being run. And that's a very important thing, I think, for the investment banker to stay on top of that, to understand what's going on with working capital, to Michael's point, and to what Simon has said before, to make sure that that is properly negotiated, because that's some money that can be left on the table by the seller if that is not calculated correctly.
Mm-hmm. Great.